What's good, YouTube? Steel here, and today's meta report will be a little different. As it being the final one, Shining Revelry, it kind of made making like a standard meta report kind of redundant, as not only is the format very similar to what it was the week prior, but it's also like coming to a close. So like none of the information I'm currently giving really like reflects anything that you could like take away or do much about and like immediately or like at face value. So instead of simply like reporting what happened this past weekend, I would like to look at the entire like Shining Revelry format as a whole, looking how the meta evolved technically from the very beginning, from set one, like from week 1 of the release all the way to now, with our very first meta recap. As always, if you enjoy this type of content or anything Pokemon Pocket, please consider liking and subscribing, as with the new set dropping in just a couple days, the content will really start like flowing, as between expert solo battles, new deck builds, pack openings, everything. The release of a new set always becomes with like a lot of content. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing, and above all else, stay pro. Before getting to the recap as a whole, I did want to look quickly over the results of the past weekend. As you can see here, Giratina continued to hold the top spot, significantly so, with basically the exact same play rate as the week prior. And the only noticeable difference from the top 5 is like how Meowscarada and Magnezone kind of got slashed in half in terms of play rate. And I do believe this is due to like how much it struggled against Darkrai Giratina last week, which kind of leads to like people being like either afraid or not very convinced into playing it. Although it was due to like Darkrai Giratina's kind of like molding their play style, or at least knowing how to deal with that matchup, as their win rate completely dropped, just like the deck dropped. Other than that, the metagame pretty much stayed the same, and we could just jump it right into top 64. Jumping into top 64, we can see that Darktina continues to dominate in overwhelming fashion, taking up half of the representation in Top Cut, although it is a decrease from last week where it took up 41 slots, I think, 41 out of the 64, which is like led to like almost like over 67%, like some crazy amount of the Top Cut. However, I do believe it's a shame that this was how the season concluded, because it kind of showed light into like a better like tournament experience. As yes, top 64 looked like this, but going into like top 16, we saw one like the most diverse like crops. I think it was like an even split between Gyarados, Darkrai Giratina, Charizard. Like all these decks were like performing very well. And although it came down to a Gyarados mirror match for the finals, we did see top 8 include decks like Darkrai Giratina, Rampardos, Meowscarada, and even an Arceus deck with Carnivine. And not to mention Charizard. I almost forgot to mention Charizard was also in the top 8. So like top 8 had multiple decks, which is not something we had seen like up to now, where like the past few weeks when Giratina was winning everything, it just felt like everything in the top cut was that, besides like maybe one deck. Like last week it was Gyarados, the week before that was Meowscarada. Like, but this week kind of felt like had this meta kept going, like there was like, it wasn't like all hope wasn't lost, I guess. Meaning that maybe in like the near future, we look back at this format and it's not as bad as like people were talking about it while we were going through it. Regardless, we could finally get to what I'm excited to talk about, which is the meta recap, looking at like how these decks span through the entire format that was Shining Revelry. Now we're officially getting into the recap, as the chart you can see on the screen shows the top 5 decks of the format based on play rate, as well as how that play rate has changed week to week throughout the format. For clarification, the numbers being used for this recap are from the Earthsea Day weeklies. Week 1 is Earthsea Day 22, and week 5 is Earthsea Day 26. That's like the largest pocket tournament like that we have access to, not only as like players but as creators or anything. So I feel it's like the best gauge for the state of not only the format but like ranked. You get a good idea of like where it's at based on like the numbers of these tournaments, as well as Limitless TCG is a great platform to like see the stats of this tournament. You're able to see the metagame, you're able to see like how many wins and losses, you're able to see so much that I'm able to actually like put this information in front of you like confidently, knowing that this is exactly what happened in these tournaments. With that said, as you can see from the chart, I've highlighted in green the highest performances, like the highest play rates that they've seen throughout the entire format, and in red is like their lowest performances, which, as we can see with Darkrai Giratina, it held the top spot all format regardless of like how high or low the percentage was. However, it wasn't as egregious as always, as it wasn't always a third of the format. We saw it go as low as just under 15% in week 2 of the format. That, if my research is correct, I believe that week 1 was the only week in which Giratina Darkrai didn't see like a over 50% win rate. So I don't blame people for like after week 1 kind of like coming off of it, or like trying to jump on the bandwagon that was like the Mewtwo Giratina build that actually won the event, or like there was like Charizard builds that did well. Like, I'm not surprised that the Giratina Darkrai deck dipped after the first week. However, clearly it was like the wrong idea. It was just either people not used to how to play it, or haven't found like the true way to play it, because clearly from then on the deck just took off. And as we see now, it's by far the best, or at least the favorite deck. Piggybacking off of week 1, I want to talk about Mewtwo Giratina, which, as you can see here, its lowest point was week 1, when like basically nobody knew about it. However, it did win the tournament thus jumping all the way, skyrocketing to 12.9%, and it became the second most played deck that week. However, like, the more players using the deck really began to like shed light on the flaws of the deck. That despite the high ceiling, the 17 trainer list had like a lot of like room for error. As others learned to combat the strategy, it really started to take a hit on like its play rate, finishing the last 2 weeks with under 4% and only one top to its name, which is like a big downfall from going from second most played deck to just completely falling off. However, it did maintain its like top 5 spot. Gyarados was the one deck that basically maintained its play rate throughout the entire like format from the very beginning to the very end. Its lowest was at the very beginning, but it was still a 10th of the format, and constantly sat between second and third most played decks in each tournament. And as we dive deeper into the top 5, we're able to clearly see why Gyarados held its spot regardless of like how bad certain counters were. It had such a good matchup against Giratina Darkrai that it just held its own. And since it was the most popular deck, is what you would see most, regardless of like how bad you do against like Gallades or Skarmories or Carnivines. You didn't care because the majority that you were going to see was Darkrai Giratina, and you had a favorable matchup against that. And Charizard is another deck that managed to constantly find itself in the top 5 almost for the same reason as Gyarados, although far less successful. And it's 100% just because of how good it was doing against the best deck, which was what it was facing against the majority of the time, thus keeping the deck afloat. And the final deck in our top 5 is essentially didn't even exist in the first half of the season, mainly because it wasn't until week 3 till we saw it actually have success. And in week 1, nobody was playing this deck. And we're talking about Magnezone Meowscarada. However, as a deck that was initially advertised as a counter to Darkrai Giratina, it began to struggle exclusively versus that matchup, whether it's because players got used to what it did, or they shifted their strategies to playing Jotagon or Rocky Helmets to kind of like max out their way to counter the I guess the aggressiveness of these Meowscarada lists. But yeah, once Darkrai Giratina figured out the matchup, it really hurt the play rate. As you can see, it went from steadily 9% to cutting almost by half, going down to 5% in the final tournament of the season. Now I want to take a look at what might seem like a random assortment of 5 decks, but these were actually the top 5 decks played in the final week of Triumphant Light. And in this recap, I want to kind of like take a quick look. I'm not gonna go too into detail about the matchups and stuff, but I just wanted to see how they fared going into Shining Revelry and beyond. To nobody's surprise, all these decks were at their highest at the beginning of the format, be it because players had yet to get the new cards, or maybe players still believed these old decks could have a fighting chance. Ultimately, some decks put a better fight than others. Dialga Arceus, for example, saw its best performance week 1, finishing somehow in second place, although it being like the only player that topped that day. And yet its play rate and success fell off a cliff after that. Despite never truly hitting 0, like it didn't die as a deck, there were still people playing it throughout. It never replicated success from week 1, and much less the success it had in the prior format. Another deck that was rather disappointing, at least based on expectations, was Darkrai EX. As coming into the format, it was expected to be like the counter to Giratina. As you can see, it had like a 12% play rate. It was the second most used deck week 1 of the format. However, it never really kicked its gears and never saw success, as it eventually fell off to being as low as under 2% play rate in the final week of the season, as well as I think only got 1 top 8 all season. So a deck that was expected to do huge numbers or have great success just completely fell off. And I'm yet to be able to tell you like why. I'm aware that there's like certain lines in which Darkrai Giratina is able to one-shot a Gallade no matter like what situation, like what build-up they have. But the fact that it saw like no success while decks like Gyarados and Giratina were, I mean, Gyarados and Charizard was, I don't know. Gallade's definitely a deck that I could see coming back, especially now with like Rare Candy's announcement and all that, but time will tell. Rampardos is the only list that managed to pick up traction like from week 1 to the end. Although it did fall off towards the middle, it basically finished exactly where it started. And despite me not being personally a big fan of the Rampardos, mainly because I struggle with like consistency and I never find the falso and all that, so that's like a personal problem, I gotta give credit when it's due. And Rampardos strategy is capable of taking on just about any deck in the format, and if it's firing all cylinders, it will do so. Meanwhile, Weavile Darkrai, one of my favorite decks, especially when it first came out in Space Time, it just fell victim to like all the Meowscarada and Grass strategies that came out, whether it was Executor, Carnivine, Beedrill. Like all these decks have like a weakness advantage. I have a, I guess, strength advantage. Like point is, Darkrai and Weavile are weak to all these decks, and they saw abundance, whether it was like only like 10 of these or 15 of this, and like it was never like a huge chunk, but the wide array of grass decks definitely limited how successful Weavile could be. And 18 Trainer Articuno, I'm not even gonna talk about. That deck fell off a cliff. It literally went from the top 5 deck in the previous format to just not seeing any play whatsoever. I think most people that were playing 18 Trainer just shifted to 17 Trainer in the Mewtwo Giratina. I can't confirm that because I wasn't either one. Like I wasn't an 18 Trainer player and I'm not a 17 Trainer. But regardless, that deck basically it's gone, and I don't see it coming back. Yes, I know in ranked people were playing it, but there was better options throughout, and I guess time could prove me wrong. Like, enough supporters could come out where something like this returns, but as far as for now, I don't see 18 trainers doing anything in the immediate future. The final part of this recap will be a deeper look back at the top 5 decks of the format, and not only how they performed, but also how they transformed through the weeks. As you can see here, we have the most successful Darkrai Giratina list from week 1 of the format. As you can see, players were already on like meta defining cards such as like Mars to like disrupt hands, but Darktina players were like we're playing like far more Pokemon at the start of the format. As you can see, cards like Druddigon to be walls, and they were using like the healing Shaman to like constantly heal like that 10 damage, sort of to combat what your Darkrai and like what other Darkrai's were doing. However, we clearly saw that we changed from that to depend on more like potions and stuff. It is the far more consistent 4 Pokemon version that truly saw this strategy take over, as only playing Darkrai and Giratina allowed to make room for a more effective like toolbox version of the deck that opted to max out on cards like I mentioned Potion. You were playing the 2 giant capes. Like, you were making sure that you were like surviving certain ranges, and not only the mirror but other matchups, as well as cutting down on Pokemon allowed for more room for cards such as like Team Rocket Grunt and Pokemon Center Lady that could really like change the course of a battle. And looking at the total wins and loss records for Giratina list, Darkrai Giratina list, all throughout the entire format, we can see like why decks like Charizard and Gyarados were like so relevant. As you can see, it was like completely, they definitely had the favor overall. Like, we're talking about hundreds of games here, like a huge sample size, and they constantly were like getting the upper hand. At least it was like 60-40 on in their favor. But then decks that kind of trailed off towards the ends, like the Meowscarada and Mewtwo, clearly Darkrai Giratina started getting the benefit of in winning those matchups. Although it does say Meowscarada Magnezone is like a 50% chance, you gotta think, I mean a 50-50, you gotta think that that's like heavily skewed, because early on they were taking the matchup like clearly, but towards the end it almost like the Meowscaradas were like really struggling to win, and that's why it completely shifted to where Darkrai Giratina had the advantage. Overall, Darkrai Giratina was by far the most popular and effective deck this format, taking home 3 wins out of the 5 major tournaments, as well as maintaining a 52% win rate throughout the entire format, which was a sample of almost 5,000 games, which is crazy to think about. Now, looking at deck number 2, we see that Gyarados began the season as expected, in the sense that it's the most successful performance week 1 came from a deck with no intentions of like countering any meta or disrupting anything, as the sole focus was establishing Gyarados and hoping it was enough to close out the game. However, it was the far more like teched out version that finally took home the win, as Gyarados players began to find room for cards such as Mars that truly became a key card in the format this time around. Once again, having the ability to disrupt strategies early, such as like Meowscarada finding its pieces, or more importantly, preventing your opponent from like holding on to its finishing strategy, whether it be a copy of Cyrus or Sabrina, or even like a red to finish you off. Being able to potentially remove that win condition from your opponent's hand at any point in the game, especially the end game, is invaluable. And alongside cards like Giant Cape, which put Gyarados at 200 HP, which made it very hard for decks, especially like Giratina Darkrai, which was like the most popular one, from finding a range to knock you out. As for their win-loss record, Gyarados really thrived in the fact that there was so much Giratina Darkrai in the format, as being able to go toe-to-toe with the #1 deck is a lot better, and not even one-to-one, as they are, I mean, not even toe-to-toe, as they had a 55% win rate, which is absurd. You're basically able to sacrifice the fact that there's certain counters that will auto beat you, like given like their best hand against your best hand, they will win when you know that you have like the upper hand against the most popular deck, right? Charizard is a deck that I honestly have been hating on all season. In my hot take video, my initial like take for like what I submitted as my hot take was that I find it actually more annoying to go against decks like Charizard than it was like to have a Darktina go against me. And week to week, I kept pointing out how the win rate was low despite it seeing like significant or decent results. Like Gyarados, it excelled against Darkrai Giratina, thus making it where it could survive the fact that it has such bad win rates against everything else. But before we take a look at all those total win rates or its final iteration, I wanted to point out how Charizard saw essentially the opposite transformation from Gyarados, as Gyarados went from like a streamlined strategy that just wanted to put Gyarados and deal damage to like something more teched out, you know, playing Mars, Cape here and there. Charizard saw like the opposite, where it started playing Shaman. There was lists like this one that was playing the Retreat Shaman. There was others playing the Heal Shaman. Eventually, they basically cut all of that out and transformed it to the list that we'll see today. As you can see, the most successful Charizard list that ended up going top 8, I believe, in this past tournament was a deck that maxed out on both Iono and Pokemon Communication, making sure that it found its answers as quickly as possible. You just want to get to a Charizard And also you can see that they maxed out on X speed, because you really want to make it where like if you lead Charmander, you want to get it out of there as quick as possible without having to give up the turn. Like you still want to set up that Moltres ramp, as well as when you are ready to attack with Charizard, you want to be able to take out Moltres without having to commit any extra energy to it. You just want to give it its initial one to start dancing, and past that, if you could just X speed it out, it's ideal. And as mentioned before, this deck averaged very well below 50% in total win rate against the entire format. However, a 55% win rate against the most popular and most played deck, I guess that's like saying the same thing, but regardless, making it the majority of what it's gonna face completely made up for the fact of how poorly it did against everything else, which is why you see Gyarados and Charizard be such like strong or dominant forces in the format. And it's not because of how good they are as a whole, it's just how good they are against the best deck, which maybe in the next format, if we see more variety, decks like these will struggle to like keep their ground, but only time will tell. Like, as I keep mentioning, we don't know exactly what's coming out. Although Charizard does get a buff from Rare Candy, similar to like what we mentioned earlier with Gallade. Meowscarada as a strategy saw many different versions, from Beedrill to Arceus to just like a pure, just playing just the Meowscarada line. And ultimately it was the Magnezone Meowscarada that saw the most success, but it being a deck that didn't really see play until like halfway through the format in week 3 is that it started topping and seeing almost like 10% play rate. It didn't really see many changes as or differences from week to week like other decks did, as the changes were like more of a preference and not so much of a meta call like other decks had. As for win rates, I believe Darkrai Giratina players adapting to how this deck works or really put a halt to like the play rate as well as its success, as the deck had great numbers across the table, as you can see, well over like almost 60% win against Gyarados, against Charizard, against Mewtwo, but it really tanked towards the end against Giratina Darkrai, which the same way that's what held Charizard and Gyarados into the format. It completely knocked out this deck. Although it wasn't completely knocked out, that's an exaggeration or like a hyperbole. It definitely saw much less play rate due to this fact that it struggled against the best and most popular deck. Mewtwo Giratina is truly a deck that peaked early, and I believe it was the surprise factor that allowed it for it to see such early success. Alongside its week 1 tournament and like noticeable players using it on their climb to Master Ball rank, I'm clearly like talking about Joe. I don't know how to pronounce it, unfortunately. That's why I kept it like that. But regardless, seeing him climb it kind of like put everybody on notice on like this is not only what the deck does, but how to do it. Especially like decks on videos on like, oh, this is how to play, blah blah blah. That like led to like its downfall almost, as people began to like know or like be prepared for what it does. Like the surprise factor was gone and its flaws like really started like showing. And then it began to struggle against Darkrai Giratina, which basically tanked any success it could potentially have. Add to that I believe it has a pretty high learning curve, and you get a deck that struggled to get any success or anywhere close to like what it was able to do early on. Ultimately, this 17 trainer list continues to be like an ever-changing toolbox that can adapt to the state of the meta. And I wouldn't be surprised if like it manages to make some noise next season, especially if one, people are not expecting as much, and two, if Darkrai sees a lot less play, because the fact that Darkrai had like the type advantage, I feel like went a long way into like knocking the deck off the top. Even this season, it quickly saw the additions of cards like Geo to add certain knockout ranges, whether it was to hit like Magnemites and Sprigatitos and stuff like that for 60 with your Mewtwo, as well as opting for 2 Sabrinas rather than the 1/1 line of like the standard 1/1 line of Sabrina Cyrus, as this deck tends to like one-shot everything once it's set up, so you don't really care for Cyrus. So like those little details and changes is what's something that I could believe like this deck could be a threat like in the future. It all depends on like what else is a threat in the future, if that makes sense. Because like the fact that Darkrai Giratina was the threat this time around kind of limited Mewtwo Giratina's list. Success. And I think in moving forward, it does have potential. Just like 18 trainer constantly came back, I believe 17 trainers currently filling that slot. And again, it's one of those things where only time will tell. And maybe you'll look back at this and think this guy's crazy, or maybe you'll look back at this and it's like, damn, this guy really knew what he was talking about. Overall, I was a big fan of the format, despite it beginning to drag definitely towards the end, whether it was because of how much I ranked or just how much I played in general. It did get a little boring towards the end, but I still believe that at its best, like Darkrai Giratina mirror matches kind of felt like chess, as long as both players had like access to perfect hands. Like obviously if one breaks and the other doesn't, there wasn't much of a chess or any kind of match in that scenario. Regardless, I'm more than ready for a change of pace, and I'm looking forward and hoping that this new set continues to do what prior sets have done without like too much power creep. Just like change up like what the top decks are, while other decks from the past still come back and do something. I would love to see that still be a thing. With that said, I would like to ask y'all that despite not knowing exactly what's coming from the next set, you know, we know like Rare Candy, we know what like the cover cards do. What current like top 5 decks do y'all think is still gonna be relevant coming into next format? Like, because as we saw, the Triumphant Light format had top 5 decks in that format completely did nothing, like past the first week of this format. So I wonder if we're gonna see something similar, or if the decks this time around will be a little more resilient. Again, we don't know for sure, but I would like to see your opinions based on like what cards do or what they've revealed so far. Also, if you made it this far into the video, I want to thank you for watching, and please consider subscribing as we post all things Pokemon Pocket on this channel. And above all else, stay pro.